Hello, I'm Carrie Bendel, here to give you a big warm welcome to this Power Financial Planning webinar and to welcome today's guest, Amyr Rocha Lima. Good morning, Amyr. How are you? Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Kerry. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Amyr Rocha Lima. I'm a partner at Holland, Hahn & Wills, a financial planning and wealth management firm that specializes in retirement planning. Firstly, I'd like to thank the PFS Power team for inviting me to speak here today. It's always an honor to be speaking to my peers about some of the practical skills that are so important in our profession, and with regards to asking great questions in particular, it's a topic that I'm so passionate about. As we all know, the very foundation of doing financial planning starts with gathering client information in order to produce financial plans that not only analyze a client situation, but also provide recommendations to help them actually realize their goals. But the process of data gathering to do financial planning involves a lot more than simply gathering financial data. Asking questions and listening to the client's stories, the stories behind their numbers, as it were, is a big part of being a financial planner. And excelling in this endeavor requires a unique set of skills led by a mixture of intellectual curiosity, compassion, empathy, and wonder. As a result, knowing how to ask questions that elicit trust and create rapport can be vital for financial planners to gather the information they need, both financial and personal information that is, to ultimately formulate the best financial planning recommendations for their clients. So my brief for today is to talk to you about how I've strived to develop more meaningful conversations with my clients through asking better questions, and why I believe that we, human financial planners, can create social value in a way a robo-advisor algorithm never could. But first, allow me to start with a story about just how much you can do with a single question. It's the story that Mikhail Gorbachev tells about the greatest question he's ever been asked. I want you to cast your mind back to 2008, and Gorbachev was touring the US to talk about nuclear weapons and why they should be abolished. And this tour, of course, as you would expect, came with endless media commitments. Now, just in case anyone watching this webinar doesn't know who Gorbachev is, in a nutshell, he was the last leader of the Soviet Union, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize for his pivotal role in ending the Cold War. In other words, when it comes to global politics, this guy was a big deal. Well, Gorbachev had already spent a full day answering questions about nuclear weapons and world politics when the last interview of the day came around. And Gorbachev's publicist, in an attempt to spare him from another set of formulaic questions, told that last journalist of the day that the interview slot had been cut down from 1 hour to 10 minutes, and that there was nothing they could do about it. This, by the way, included any introductions, the typical pleasantries, and the time it took for the translator to translate the journalist's questions into Russian and then translate Gorbachev's answers back into English again. Now, I'm going to pause the story here for a second and just say that in our own way, I trust that you can already start seeing some of the parallels with the situation that we might find ourselves in. Imagine a prospective client comes into a meeting with us. They might arrive a little late. They tell us that they need to leave a bit earlier than expected. And, oh, by the way, Amyr, I've already seen a couple of other IFAs this week. And right now, I feel that I understand pensions as much as I understand Russian. That is not at all. Well, back to the story. To capture Gorbachev's attention quickly, the journalist decided to go straight to the heart. So his first question was, what is the biggest lesson you learnt from your father? Now, Gorbachev describes being surprised by this question. He says that he didn't answer the question immediately. Instead, he looked up and he just didn't have a formulaic answer to give back, because this question really got him thinking. It was like a movie was playing in his mind. And then Gorbachev started telling the journalist a story. And it's the story about the day his father got called to fight in World War II. You see, Gorbachev lived in a farm in the Russian hinterlands. And it was a long way away from the town that had the train station where his father would have to join the other men to go to war. And so the whole family took this trip together with the dad to wish him farewell. And when they got to the town, Gorbachev's dad took the family to this little shop and treated them all to ice cream. Now, Gorbachev goes on to tell this story, full of intricate detail, describing the flavor of the ice cream he had that day, and even the aluminum cup that the ice cream came in. And every time his publicist interrupts to say the time is up, he waves his hand and he says, "I want to speak to him," pointing at that journalist. Eventually, Gorbachev gets to the punchline. The answer to the journalist's question was that the biggest lesson he had learned from his father was the feeling he had during that moment, seeing his dad go off to war and knowing that he might never see him again. And he didn't want any other child to have that feeling ever again. So the bottom line is this. When asking questions, first aim for the heart, as this will lead you on a pathway to the soul. Now, in our role as financial planners, unfortunately, there isn't one magic question we can ask to get to our clients' hearts. But there are hundreds of winning questions which will definitely get us closer to that goal. Just like that journalist did with Gorbachev, if you can make someone feel that you are genuinely curious about a subject that they are passionate about, there's a good chance they will become comfortable and open up to you. Asking somebody about a subject they love makes them happy for two reasons. One, many people feel they aren't listened to enough or at all. So through your questions, you can make them feel appreciated and respected. And two, many people will be grateful that your question made them think about an area that they are passionate about, and they'll generally want to dive deeper into that subject. The sense of comfort that you're creating with these questions will lead to a sense of trust, and trust is what leads the way for your follow-up questions. Now, you might be thinking, but come on, Amyr, how do I aim a question at the heart, as you're saying, when, for example, I've never met these prospective clients that are coming into my office before? Well, here's the approach that I take. At the initial meeting with a prospective client whom I've never met before, of course, it's tempting to list all the reasons why I should be the one to help them with their financial problems. However, instead of going straight into salesperson mode, after the initial pleasantries, I begin the meeting by asking them this question. What prompted you to contact a financial planner? Your prospect will have the opportunity to explain what they feel they need help with, and you'll have a chance to actively listen. Which brings me to a really important point, because listening to the answer is as important as asking the question. If you're not actively listening to the responses that your client or prospective client is giving you, then it really doesn't matter how good your questions are. In fact, whenever I speak to groups of financial planners, this is the common message that comes through. If there is one skill that seems to have a bigger impact above all else for the success of a financial planner, it's the ability to listen, to really listen. Active listening is where we begin to hear not just what is verbally being said, but we also start perceiving some non-verbal communication signals as well, from posture to eye contact and gestures. Now, I appreciate that we're currently meeting clients virtually in the main, so, this becomes a little bit harder, but you can still engage in active listening by reflecting back and paraphrasing what's being said to clarify your understanding of it, and also to help the client connect the dots between what they're looking for and what your services are, showing them real empathy along the way. This will give you the pathway to see solutions grow naturally out of a conversation with the client. So when listening, remember, treat the other person, even if it's through Zoom or Teams, or eventually when we get back to see them in person, treat the other person as if they're the only other person on the planet. Remember that we're not just listening for words. For example, tone of voice may tell us more than the actual words. And always remember, your next question may depend on what you've just heard, or it may depend on what you haven't heard and are curious about. After all, the key skill for the modern advisor is to learn to think about their clients' life goals, not just their assets, as this can provide, it can prove to be a really valuable differentiator in helping you describe the value that your services can provide them. Because as we all know, we're primarily in the people business. We just happen to be working with people's money. Now, in my experience, the majority of IFAs believe that they spend enough time already actively listening to their clients. But in reality, though, whenever anybody goes through an exercise of perhaps recording their meeting and listening to it afterwards, many will agree with me that they have a strong tendency to talk about their expertise, knowledge, services, products, and solutions first, and only secondarily get around to actually hearing what the client really wants and needs, much less talking or taking the proactive steps necessary to make the client feel truly heard and understood. And new planners in particular really struggle with these skills. And there's so much to absorb in the first place. Not only do they need to pay attention to the verbal and non-verbal communication with the client, but then they're trying to really understand it, to then reflect it back to the client, and then to connect with the client. And all of this during the meeting might start to feel quite overwhelming. The feedback that I get from next-gen planners is that their mind races to connect the financial planning concepts that they've recently learned to the discussion that is actually happening and is underway during the meeting, whilst simultaneously trying to capture this information in notes to work on later. And on top of this, they're also thinking about the probing questions to ask to determine which recommendations or solutions may ultimately be correct. Now, the common end result with this is that eventually the newer planner, the younger planner, typically just ends up talking more than listening, especially if they're also trying to demonstrate their value as an expert in the first place. So to all the next generation or younger planners watching this webinar, if I had to recommend one skill for you to learn that would be the biggest positive impact on your career as a financial planner, it would be learning to engage active listening skills effectively. Trust me when I say, because I've learned this the hard way, Financial planners that can do this ultimately deliver solutions that seem obvious to the client because they match their needs and the situation that's at hand perfectly. So here are some helpful tips in engaging in active listening. Firstly, be quiet and actively encourage the other person to talk through head nods or guttural sounds. Avoid interrupting the other person when they're speaking. I know it sounds obvious, but it's easier said than done. Avoid starting to think about your answer when the other person is speaking. Really be there and pay attention to what they're saying. And don't finish their sentences or fill in any blanks, no matter how tempting it is. In the end, good listening is all about promoting your clients' or prospective clients' willingness to communicate. So you need to be comfortable with silence. Staying silent gives you time and gives the opportunity for them to share extra information with you. And I promise you, it will feel odd initially to allow sort of long pauses to happen between the exchange between you and your client, but you'll be amazed at how often more information emerges after a moment's silence. So stop thinking too much about elaborating the perfect question, as it were, and focus on listening to the clients instead. With this in mind, let me suggest a follow-up question to question number one, which I think might be a good one for you to have in your sort of client question bank. You might ask the client, what would be a great outcome for you in working with a financial planner? This will prompt your prospective client to set out their expectations for how they believe a financial planner can help them. Essentially, they will be telling you what they want from you, giving you a chance to then match and exceed their expectations with your services. In fact, to really give you all the ammunition you need to make a prospective client feel valued in your first meeting with them, you might even want to follow up this question with, what would be a great outcome for you from this meeting today? If you want to stand out against any competition, the client needs to walk away from their meeting with you feeling happy about the time they invested in it. After all, financial planning, and in my case, retirement planning in particular, is more than just about how much money they've got. It's about the quality of life that these clients or prospective clients want to achieve and then maintain for themselves and their loved ones. And through asking good questions and then really listening to their answers, you can show them that you care about that. So this question flows naturally from the first and second questions that I've shared with you so far, ensuring your prospective client leaves the meeting feeling appreciated and confident that they've really had a chat about how your services can match with their requirements. Which brings me actually to another really important point, because you need to have patience. You need to have patience because the answer that you're looking for rarely comes from your first question. That's why having a series of questions that progressively get your client or prospective client to open up about their goals is what gets you the best information to then be able to position your services accordingly. Great listening can make your follow-up questions more valuable than any of your opening questions. So, I don't know, play a game. Imagine your follow-up questions as a shovel digging for gold. You know, sometimes the gold is well below the surface and you have to keep digging to get to it. Remember, if you move along the surface to another area, just to keep on this analogy, and ask another open-ended question, or another opening question for that matter, you may have walked past the gold. And if you keep moving along and digging your shovel in once before moving on, you may never get to the gold at all. But if you dig up some courage and have patience and keep digging in one specific area, pausing, allowing your client to talk, maybe following up with a simple, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? You'll definitely come to those treasured answers. Which brings me to the next point. You need to prepare to improvise. So here's a tip. Think about your last 10 client meetings and sit down and write out some of the questions that had the biggest positive impact in those meetings. You know, in my early days as a financial planner, I did this before every client meeting. And at one point, I think I had a bank of around 50 or 100 questions. And I'll just walk around with these questions in my mind. But I wasn't memorizing them. I was more like inhaling them. That way, the questions would be stored up in my head like records in an old jukebox. And I would observe the flow of the meeting, and I would activate the appropriate ones, as it were. In other words, I had prepared the questions that I wanted to ask, but I was improvising on the best timing to release them based on the flow of the conversation. And this approach, at least I felt, makes the back and forth between you and the client more spontaneous. And it builds on the sense of trust that you've created because you're involved in a conversation as opposed to being involved in an interview. And remember, the more trust you create, the better their answers will be. Here are a few of my favorite questions to help you start building your own question bank. Again, as a firm, we focus mainly on retirement planning. So this question, what does retirement mean to you, is a biggie for us. Because for many people, retirement isn't about giving up work and doing nothing during their golden years. Some retirees may want to carry on working to some extent, perhaps on a part-time basis, which would mean that they'd be generating some level of income. Well, that's really important information for the building of their financial plan. Others may want to spend time traveling, in which case a healthy retirement income being derived from pensions or an investment portfolio, of course, would be vital. And often, one half of a couple, for example, might have entirely different views on retirement to the other. So it's vital for us to have this conversation with our clients early on in the financial planning process. Another of my favorite questions to ask is, what are your biggest concerns right now? And I would ask this if the client has not volunteered this information when answering any of the questions that we've gone through so far in this presentation. You know, they might be worried about something which in turn could directly affect their financial situation. And their answer may result in you recommending a completely different strategy for them than the one that you had perhaps initially planned. And remember, every time you get ready to speak during a conversation, take a breath before you do so. This will stop you from cutting off the other person, and it will transmit a message to them that you've thought about what they've just said and that you're delivering a considerate response. Here's one final question to help you in building your own question bank. What changes or challenges do you expect to happen in the next 5 years? Now, I know that predicting the future is impossible, but your client may have an idea of life events coming up over the next few years, like redundancies on the horizon at work, or a child's university fee schedule coming up, and this may change their financial priorities, especially when they've had the chance to discuss it with somebody like you, a financial planner, who has context behind the effect of these life changes on people's finances. Now, I have found that this question really gets to the heart of what matters to the client in the short term. And in my experience, if you can help appease your client's short-term concern, you'll free up a lot of headspace for them to work with you on their long-term plans and aspirations. Okay, so allow me to switch gears on you for a moment, because so far in this webinar, we've focused on a questioning framework where you are asking the questions. But how about when a client or a prospective client directs a question at you? What framework should you use to be able to give really good answers? And I bring this up following some conversations that I've been part of on Twitter recently, given obviously the times we're living through with the COVID pandemic, Brexit on the horizon, and the recent US election, all taking over our clients' TVs, radio, and social media channels. So I think it's important that we think about how to diffuse, or at the very least, deflect any sort of apocalyptic questions and objections without actually accepting the challenge to explain or defend our own personal position or investment strategy, and much more importantly, without getting into an argument. So the method I use when thinking about this is to ask myself, what's the question behind the question? Let me explain what I mean by way of an example. If a client asks you, what do you think the stock market is going to do? Well, I would suggest that you initiate your reply by actually uncovering the question behind that question, which in this case might be, actually, what are stocks? In other words, is the client on the same page as you in even understanding what the stock market is and why it might feel risky? See, in this case, you would first make sure that the client understands that, stocks are publicly traded shares in the ownership of businesses, as, for example, differentiated from, say, bonds, which are packages of debt in those same businesses. Now, once you've established this, you would then have the basis in which to continue on to the next level of questions, such as what are the risk and return characteristics of stocks versus bonds? How does an efficient market value stocks? What financial goals are stocks better suited for compared to bonds, etc., etc., etc. So this method of establishing first the question behind that question, as it were, it allows you to have an informative dialogue with your client or prospective client without feeling like you have to defend any sort of position or enter into any sort of confrontational argument. So from today onwards, when a question is directed back at you, remind yourself not to be anywhere nearly as concerned with knowing the answer as with being as sure as possible that you're getting the question behind the question framed correctly in the first place. Let's look at another example of this, one which I believe a lot of financial planners have gone through over these past few weeks. Imagine that you're meeting with one of your favorite clients. You've helped them achieve their retirement dreams, and they've really been enjoying this new chapter in their lives. However, like all clients, they are not immune to the news. So after the initial pleasantries, they hit you with this zinger. Won't all this deficit spending ultimately cause an inflationary spike? Blah, blah, blah. Now, as tempting as it might be for you to go into your personal views on this, remember what we've just gone through. Ask yourself, what's the question behind that question? And in this case, it might turn out to be something like, well, shouldn't we, get out of the market and hedge our, portfolio against inflation? Maybe by buying gold, like the Telegraph or the Guardian have been talking about? And at this point, you've double checked your understanding of that question behind the question, but there's no harm in playing back your understanding to the client, which in this case might go something like, so let me just double check that I understand you, Mr. and Mrs. Client. We're really not having a conversation about whether there is or isn't going to be an upsurge in inflation, right? You're assuming that there will be. And what we're talking about now is you asking me whether we should have a major shift in your investment portfolio to defend against it. Is that right? To which, of course, your clients might reply to you, well, but shouldn't we be pursuing our goals by protecting our portfolio? And now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're getting closer to the point. And you can say something like, okay, I think I understand the real question, Mr. and Mrs. Client, but let me just make sure that that's the case. You know that we arrange your investment portfolio to synchronize long-term historical returns with your long-term goals. That's what we do. And you're asking me whether it would be better just to change that portfolio with every new bit of news in anticipation of economic or market outcomes, which we know we can't predict nor time with any consistency. Look, I've elaborated on this too much, of course, in this little simple case study, but I'm sure the listeners to this webinar will recognize these sort of conversations and would have been part in chats like this with their clients throughout this whole period we've been living through. But as you can see, by seeking to uncover the question behind the question, you actually create clarity in the client's mind. And you can steer the conversation away from the toxic subject at hand and back to the client's financial plan. And no doubt they'll leave that meeting feeling lucky to have you in their lives. So to sum it up, what are some of the lessons that you can draw from my presentation today? Well, I'm going to suggest three takeaways for you to think about. Number one, start a conversation, not an interview. Ask a question, shut up, and listen to the response. And then use the answer to frame your follow-up questions. And use follow-up questions that tell you more about the story behind your client's numbers. See how deep your follow-up questions can take you, and see how long this conversation can go on before it runs out of steam. Remember, the goal is to see if this conversation takes you to a place where you would both like to have another conversation. 2, practice listening. I'm sure you'll agree by now that listening sounds easiest and obvious, but it's not. So when you engage in a conversation with a client or a prospective client, remember your emphasis is on learning. Every time you get ready to speak during the conversation, take a breath before you do so. This will stop you from cutting off the other person, and it will also transmit a message to them that you've thought about what they've just said and that you're actually delivering a considerate response back to them. And 3, prepare to improvise. Write a list of questions that have had the biggest positive impact on previous client meetings you've had. Think about them for a while and then put them away. When you do have your meeting, allow these questions to come out naturally in the flow of the conversation. And I'm going to ask you this. Just notice how prepared you're going to feel for whatever direction the conversation ends up segueing towards. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some advice from someone who made a living out of asking questions. In a career spanning over 60 years, this guy had conversations with presidents, pop stars, sporting champions, business tycoons, nuclear scientists, fighter pilots, you name it. And I think he can teach us a really simple but very important lesson. I never learnt anything while I was talking. Think about that in your next client meeting. By really listening to what your client is saying about their goals, their concerns, and their dreams, you'll be able to deliver a sound financial plan that will get them to where they want to be. And by connecting with them on a personal level, you're more likely to build a solid, long-term relationship with them too. Thank you.
Amyr, thank you so much. That was excellent. You know, what a trip through that first client conversation. Very well done. We haven't any questions from the audience yet, but I do have one or two I'd like to ask you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
At what point did you realise you had to sort of grasp this whole thing and start learning fast about it? You've obviously learned fast because, you know, you've done so much. When did you sort of sit there and think, I've really got to change the way I handle these conversations? Yeah,
that's a fantastic question, Kerry, because I don't think I've spoken about that enough. You know, it was an uncomfortable, introspective conversation that I had to have with myself, right? So at the time, more so than now, so I'm in my mid-30s, but, you know, at the time when I was figuring this out, I was in my late 20s, and I looked like I was in my late 20s, so I looked really young. And I've always worked with retirement planning clients. So there was obviously this perception that I felt I needed to get over, that, you know, even though I was a young guy, there was value in engaging with me over and above any financial products, because I was going to be around for the client's retirement, because I wasn't going to retire when they were going to retire. And when I figured that out, I started noticing that conversations around that and sort of hanging my hat on building a relationship where I understood the client, I understood their family needs, their family goals, their family challenges, and I helped them match their money towards those goals and those challenges. That was a lot more powerful than any financial product, than any fund that I could ever talk about. When I realized that, I'm not kidding, I changed my questions and I changed my life. Because the way I presented myself to my clients and prospective clients meant more ongoing, successful relationships were to be had.
And how do you practice doing this? I mean, assuming you don't practice straight away on clients, or maybe you do, start with easy questions and then sort of, you know, try and build it up with clients. But how do you practice this? Did you find other people to do it with?
Yeah, so that's really, really interesting. I have been asked by other planners to do role plays with them. And for anybody listening to this webinar, be it live or recorded, feel free to get in touch. My contact details are on the PFS Power website, and I'll be more than happy to book some time where we could do some role playing. And nowadays, of course, we can do that with Zoom or Teams. And I think that is definitely powerful. But Kerry, to your point, if the listeners to this webinar go back to the 6 questions I suggested, they will notice that none of those questions should feel awkward. I would urge them to look themselves in the mirror and just ask themselves any of those questions. And I'm pretty confident that they will not feel awkward about any of those questions. In other words, I'm not going for some sort of quirky, hippie, sort of mindful type question where it is so intricate that I might feel actually embarrassed to ask it from some clients. These are straightforward questions, but the words that I've used are purposely put in place to make sure that they're open-ended and that they get to the story behind the client's numbers without anybody having to say to the client, hey, Mr. Client, you know, take a break. I'm going to do some quote-unquote life planning on you or anything like that. These are genuine questions that get the client to genuinely talk about their story, which then allow you to match their numbers to that story in a more efficient way.
And so you've had this great client conversation, you know, when you first meet. I mean, what's the next step? I mean, how do you sort of prepare to end that conversation, and how do you prepare the client for what might be next if they've decided that they want to work with you?
Yeah, well, if they want to work with me, I definitely feel that I've got a lot more context than I would have had otherwise to then build their financial plan. So then we would naturally move, let's say if this was a first meeting scenario, we would naturally move from a first meeting to then a formal sort of fact-finding type meeting at a different occasion. And in that fact-find meeting, whilst a lot of it would feel quite dry, because it has to in terms of gathering the actual hard facts, so to speak, from the client, every time you're asking one of those hard fact questions, you can build context behind it. So even in that meeting, you might say to the client, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, can you confirm if you've got a will in place? And they'll say, you know what, Amyr, we don't. We've been meaning to get a will for ages, but we haven't got one. Well, you don't need to stop there. You can say, look, guys, this is really important. Remember in our initial conversation where you talked about your children and your grandchildren and the legacy that you'd like to leave behind for them? Well, you know, this here is a fundamental part of being able to leave a legacy behind in a really efficient way. And even that fact-find meeting, it starts becoming more of a get organized meeting. The client leaves even what normally would be a sort of dry, heavy listing fact-find meeting feeling a lot more organized and a lot more clear about the information they've given you, and also some of those next steps that you're eventually going to be recommending to them, even though some of those next steps are not necessarily financial planning next steps. They might be to do with contacting a solicitor or an accountant to tidy up some of those auxiliary bits of their life.
Thank you, Amyr. Just a couple of other things. How long should you budget for these meetings to take? I mean, some could take a longer time than others.
Yeah, they do. And you know, Kerry, I'm a big believer of sort of not feeling myself like I'm under any sort of timer. And I also make that really clear to the client. I don't want them to feel like there's a sort of set time for us to talk. But I will say this, and I would urge the listeners to this webinar to try this out for themselves. I have meetings where the first meetings that is, where I only ask the first 3 questions that I shared with everybody on this webinar, and literally just shut up and listen to the client, and that meeting will take an hour, where I've literally asked 3 questions. Maybe in between, I've turned to the other sort of more silent partner in the couple and have said, you know, would you like to add anything to that? That's as much of a follow-up question as I would have asked, and that meeting would have gone on for an hour. And I think, you know, hour-long meetings, especially in this day and age where we're having to meet with clients virtually through Zoom, I think that's probably a good cutting off point. Now, again, I don't cut it off at an hour. I just think that typically, if you can structure the meeting with some questions that generate good conversation, by the end of about an hour and a half, you and the client would have felt that, you know, a meaningful conversation was had, and you're either ready to have and to book a follow-up conversation, or actually you realize your services or their requirements aren't a good fit for each other. And that's fine too.
Sure, thank you. And one final question. Let's assume that people might have clients already that they haven't had these conversations with. I mean, have you had instances when you've sort of had a client that you've perhaps got a relationship with, and then you've had to go back and start to have these better conversations? How did you handle that?
Yeah, huge, Kerry, and I appreciate you asking this, because I've had many occasions where that's been exactly the case. You know, going back to those existing relationships and making sure that the meetings now were more about uncovering the client's ambitions, their expectations for this next chapter in their life, their concerns about some of the things that might be, you know, coming up in the future for their children or grandchildren, and how they would like to maybe help those loved ones out. Those conversations, again, you can just go back to the questions that I've shared in this webinar and just maybe top and tail them so that they don't feel like a first question. They feel more like a conversation, and you will still be able to uncover information that you've never known about your existing clients before. Right now at our firm, Kerry, what I've been doing is having these conversations proactively around legacy. A lot of our clients are sort of in their 70s, and we're really getting deep with them into, you know, you have more money than you're ever going to spend. How amazing is it to be able to actually start planning for the next generation, not only for your children, but for your children's children and the legacy that you'll be able to leave behind to them. And I don't mean just money. I mean, some of our clients have now engaged in sort of writing memoirs about their family so that they can pass that on to their children, really having interesting conversations about that, which, look, at some point during that legacy conversation, the topic of inheritance tax and perhaps, genuinely mitigating for inheritance tax through financial planning, well, that comes up too. And in that part of the conversation, I have more context in which to be able to present an IHT planning solution to the client as well.
You make it sound so exciting, and it's clear that you're very passionate about it. And I'm going to go back in time when I first met you to a presentation that I heard you give. And, people might wonder how you find your niche or your client segment or whatever you would like to describe it. But would you like to tell the audience why you decided to focus on retirement?
Yeah, and I very much remember that too, Kerry. And, I've appreciated the sort of friendship we've developed over all those years since, I think, 2018 when I gave that presentation. So, in a nutshell for me, finding my niche was fairly natural. I came from product provider land into the financial services sector. So I worked at AXA as a business development manager and then at MetLife as a business development manager too. And the product suite that I had to be able to sell to IFAs, who were my clients, were pretty much all retirement planning type products, drawdown pension plans, annuities and things like that. So naturally, I started my career by having conversations around retirement planning, albeit on a B2B basis. So when I moved from a B2B to becoming a financial planner, and I did that on the first day of RDR, so 2013, it was natural for me to go into the sort of dormant GPP book that the first firm I joined sort of had there, just laying around these piles of files. It was natural for me to go there, contact the HR officers of those companies in which this company had originally built these GPP plans for, and just say, look, should we set up some retirement planning clinics with some of your older employees and make sure that they understand what they've built so far and what life this would enable them to have when they could no longer work or they just didn't want to work in this capacity anymore. And at the time, that went down really well. And I've got to say, some of the more meaningful conversations I've ever had as a financial planner also came from that time. I remember that I went into a firm that serviced forklift trucks, and they hired out forklift trucks. And, the guys that worked at this firm, in their overalls, all sort of full of oil all over them, working outside in the cold and servicing these forklift trucks. When I figured out this whole thing about questioning and really listening to what the client had to say, as opposed to focusing on a pension statement, I really understood that, these guys found in that hour with me, in that little financial planning clinic, they found some hope about what their life could look like when they no longer had to work on servicing these forklift trucks, which they had done for like 30 odd years. And that was amazing. And the conversations that came out of that, Kerry, were powerful. And on top of this, I also saw the power of financial planning and the effect of it on my own family. Folks can go onto my personal blog, which is www.amyr.co.uk, and they can see my story there with regards to my grandfather and what a particular life change did to him and what good financial planning meant for the legacy that he was able to leave behind to his loved ones. And that, for me, just is probably the most powerful experience I've been through myself to understand the power of good financial planning.
It is incredibly powerful, you're endorsing the word power all the time, which is fantastic, because that's what we're trying to do on the Power website, sort of help everybody understand the power that they can have to help change people's lives. And what you've described as some small moves that actually have ended up in major differences in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kerry, it's interesting because I see a question from the audience coming through, and I believe it's either from a new planner or as is the case many times, and for many calls that I get from more experienced planners, it's just about having a chat as to how they could coach their younger planners in their firms. Either or, if this is from a new planner or not, how to overcome the challenges that I referenced around sort of the mind racing and thinking about the next question. It definitely does come with practice, but let me just say this: trust yourself. And what I mean by that is, go through this webinar again. Make a note of some of the questions that I suggested. Look yourself in the mirror. Ask yourself these questions first. You'll hopefully feel, and I really do hope this, you will not feel that any of these questions are awkward. So you'll have these questions now inside your little question bank in your mind. Then just have a conversation and maybe pull out some of these questions throughout that conversation whenever you feel that the flow of the conversation allows you to do so. And then just shut up and listen. Don't take notes. You don't need notes. Have a great conversation. You trust yourself and trust your memory. And when the client has left your office or has left the virtual meeting, you will no doubt be able to remember what you need to remember that is relevant for your financial planning services. So trust yourself and then report back to me, because I'd love to hear that you did this once or twice or 3 times and you can actually see it work.
And isn't one of the key skills you also have to have? It's to be really interested in the person you're talking to. Is to have that, and that doesn't always exist, and that you really have to be interested in wanting to hear the person's story who's sitting in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I guess, is something that someone has or doesn't have. I'm just curious. I'm a curious person, and I'm learning the hard way that my little 4-year-old girl has got this genetics from me, because she can ask like just a battery of why questions, one after the other. It's incredible. But I'm just a curious person. But I think all of us are in this field. I genuinely believe that, because how awesome is it that we get to see people from every single walk of life, and we actually get to ask them questions about their life story and then about their money, so that we can match one with the other to help them build a financial plan. I mean, it's just the greatest profession to be in. So, give it a go. That's what I would say. You'll be genuinely surprised about the backstory of some of your clients. Just the other day, I spoke to this lady who, back in the day, as it were, she graduated in a drama degree, with a drama degree, and she was struggling to get into the West End, which was her ambition in life. And what she did was she joined a company called I forgot what it's called now, but it's the only female-only Shakespeare company that does their shows by traveling all around the country on a bike, on a pedal bike. So they literally carried all of their gear, all of the costumes and everything that was needed, and she got the chance to cycle from London all the way up to Edinburgh, performing Shakespeare. And of course, that caught on, and the media caught on to that at the time. And she eventually, with her company, got the chance to move to go to Singapore, to go to India and do the same thing. And curiously, and I know I'm going on a bit, but just bear with me. Curiously, she said that when she was in India, she thought, a breath of fresh air here. We get to really now just take our time and do Shakespearean plays, because of course English is not their first language, and frankly, if we get something wrong, I think people might not even notice. And she was completely flabbergasted by the fact that whilst she was there performing Shakespeare, like a whole bunch of people in the audience all around India were actually saying and mumbling the words back to the dialogue that she was saying. And she said to me, like that gave her like a massive kick up the backside. She said, wow, man, I never believed that sort of an audience in India would know Shakespeare inside out like this. And it just took her to another level. Anyway, here's the long and short of it. Up until before COVID, she was a lead actress in a West End play. So you see, you don't get to know that if what you do in your first meeting or second meeting or whatever is to focus on the pension statement or to focus on telling the client how amazing you are. You know, you get to know that by asking open-ended questions, shutting up and listening. And then you get to have that sort of conversation with the person. And even when the conversation does get to the numbers and to the products, it's much more meaningful because you can take it back to the context of what's important to that person, of the story behind their numbers.
Yes, and that's the excitement about it, isn't it? That's the true life excitement about it all. You've mentioned the word COVID. We're just about to go into another lockdown. How have you found using Zoom or similar to Zoom? How do you find having virtual meetings with new clients or existing clients at the moment?
Yeah, good point, Kerry. I think we've all had to adapt, and the good news is we've all had to adapt, right? So let's get it in our heads that we're not the only people doing this. This is the whole world. Every industry, every sector is having to do this. So by now, thankfully, it feels quite natural. Right? It's still not like my own personal bias. I like seeing clients at our office. I think we've got nice offices, and I just like meeting people face to face. But to your point, Kerry, it is possible to have meaningful conversations virtually. It is possible to build relationships virtually with our clients, be there with new clients who have signed up to our financial planning process and I've never met them in person. And also, it is possible to strengthen existing relationships with clients virtually as well. So I think it's important for us to get out of our own way, so to speak, and just understand that this is not some sort of novel approach that you or I are coming up with. This is the world we're living in at the moment. Everybody has had to adapt. So with just a few tweaks, and just maybe being able to ensure that there isn't sort of fatigue on looking at a computer screen for too long, both for you and for the client, it is totally possible to have meaningful conversations virtually, for sure.
Wonderful. What a wonderful place to end. Everything's possible.
Everything's possible, Kerry. This too shall pass.
Thank you, Amyr Rocha Lima. What a wonderful guest you've been this morning. I hope everybody's enjoyed what they've heard. We've already had some great feedback. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there. We will put a CPD certificate next to the presentation on the BrightTalk website as soon as we can. There'll be a recording of the session put on the Power website. And we really look forward to welcoming Amyr back again sometime soon. Thank you all for watching.
It's really kind. Thank you, Kerry, and thank you, everybody, for watching.
Take care. Bye.